Resurrecting the Past. The Ideological Parallels Between the KKK and Project 2025. Introduction. The American Civil War officially ended in 1865, yet the ideological battles that fueled the conflict persist in various forms to this day. The Civil War may have ended on the battlefield, but its core issues of racial inequality, states' rights, and political power continue to shape American society and politics. This document aims to substantiate this argument by examining historical patterns, ongoing political and social struggles, and the persistence of ideologies rooted in the Confederacy. By tracing the evolution of these issues from the 19th century to the present, we can better understand the continuous thread of conflict that underpins American history and its implications for the future. This exploration includes key historical events, legislative actions, and the responses of political entities that reveal the enduring nature of the Civil War's fundamental disputes. Additionally, this document will attempt to prove that the ideologies of the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, and Project 2025 are one and the same. By examining the goals, strategies, and implications of Project 2025 and comparing them to the historical and contemporary ideologies of the KKK, we aim to uncover the underlying connections that suggest a continuation of white supremacist objectives under a modern guise. This analysis will demonstrate how Project 2025's agenda aligns with the KKK's long-standing efforts to maintain racial hierarchies and suppress civil rights advancements. Proving that the Civil War is still taking place, albeit in a transformed and non-military form, involves demonstrating the continuity of conflict over the same core issues that prompted the Civil War: racial inequality, states' rights versus federal authority, and the political power structure in the United States. This can be substantiated by examining historical patterns, ongoing political and social struggles, and the persistence of ideologies rooted in the Confederacy. 1850s. Formation of the Republican Party. The Republican Party emerged in the 1850s as a coalition of anti-slavery activists, former Whigs, Free Soilers, and members of the Liberty Party. Its formation was a direct response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed for the possibility of slavery expanding into new territories based on popular sovereignty. The Republican Party opposed this potential expansion, advocating for the containment of slavery and the promotion of free labor. The party's platform was a significant factor in the increasing sectional tensions that eventually led to the Civil War. The election of Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, in 1860 prompted the secession of Southern states, as they feared his administration would restrict their rights to own slaves and undermine their economic and social order. Corwin Amendment, 1861. The Corwin Amendment, formally proposed as the 13th Amendment in 1861, was designed to protect slavery in perpetuity by preventing Congress from abolishing it. Proposed by Congressman Thomas Corwin of Ohio and passed by both houses of Congress, it was endorsed by President James Buchanan and President-elect Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, expressed no objection to the amendment, hoping to placate the Southern states and prevent secession. However, the amendment was never ratified as the Civil War commenced shortly after its proposal. The text of the amendment stated, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state." This amendment underscored the lengths to which political leaders were willing to go to maintain the institution of slavery and avoid conflict. Confiscation Acts, 1861 to 1862. During the Civil War, Congress passed the First Confiscation Act, 1861, and the Second Confiscation Act, 1862. These laws were intended to weaken the Confederate war effort by authorizing the seizure of property, including slaves, used to support the rebellion. The acts effectively declared that any Confederate property could be confiscated by Union forces. However, President Lincoln was cautious in enforcing these acts to avoid alienating border states and moderate Northerners. He instructed Union generals to return confiscated slaves to their owners if it would help maintain the loyalty of those regions. This pragmatic approach illustrated Lincoln's primary goal of preserving the Union, even if it meant compromising on the issue of slavery temporarily. 1861, Horace Greeley and Lincoln's response. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, criticized President Lincoln in an 1862 editorial titled "The Prayer of 20 Millions." Greeley accused Lincoln of failing to enforce the Confiscation Acts and demanded a more aggressive stance against slavery. Lincoln responded in an open letter on August 22, 1862, stating, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." This response highlighted Lincoln's pragmatic approach to the war and his willingness to use whatever means necessary to preserve the Union, even if it meant compromising on his personal anti-slavery beliefs. The United States Colored Troops, USCT, were a significant component of the Union Army during the American Civil War, representing a crucial development in the conflict and a major step toward the eventual abolition of slavery and the recognition of African American rights. Here's a detailed account of their formation and impact. 1863-1864. Initial resistance. At the onset of the Civil War, the idea of arming African Americans was met with resistance from both the Union and the Confederacy. Many in the North, including President Abraham Lincoln, were initially hesitant to enlist African Americans as soldiers. The prevailing sentiment was that the war was a conflict to preserve the Union rather than a fight to end slavery. Moreover, there were deep-seated racial prejudices and doubts about the capability and willingness of African Americans to fight effectively. Formation and organization. Emancipation Proclamation, January 1, 1863. The turning point came with the Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Lincoln on January 1, 1863. This proclamation not only declared the freedom of all enslaved people in the Confederate States, but also authorized the enlistment of African American men in the Union Army. This policy shift was both a strategic military decision and a moral stance against slavery. Establishment of the USCT. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, the Bureau of Colored Troops was established by the War Department on May 22, 1863, to manage the recruitment and organization of African American soldiers. Regiments of black soldiers were designated as United States Colored Troops, USCT, and their formation began in earnest. Recruitment and enlistment. Recruitment efforts. Recruitment of African American soldiers took place across the Union and in liberated areas of the Confederacy. Many African Americans, both free men from the North and formerly enslaved men from the South, volunteered to fight. Recruitment drives were often supported by prominent abolitionists and leaders within the African American community, who saw military service as a pathway to citizenship and equality. Enlistment numbers. By the end of the Civil War, approximately 180,000 African American men had served in the USCT, comprising about 10% of the Union Army. They were organized into 175 regiments, serving in various capacities including infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineering units. This substantial participation marked a significant demographic and cultural shift in the composition of the military forces. Contributions and impact combat roles. The USCT played crucial roles in numerous battles and military operations throughout the Civil War. They fought bravely in key engagements such as the Battle of Fort Wagner, the Battle of Port Hudson, and the Siege of Petersburg. Their courage and determination helped to dispel doubts about their effectiveness as soldiers and contributed to the Union's overall military success. Casualties and sacrifice. The soldiers of the USCT faced significant risks and endured harsh conditions. They often suffered higher casualty rates than their white counterparts due to being assigned to frontline and dangerous duties. Additionally, they faced brutal treatment if captured by Confederate forces, including summary execution and re-enslavement. Social and political impact. The service of the USCT had far-reaching social and political implications. Their participation challenged prevailing racial stereotypes and laid the groundwork for the broader civil rights movement. The valor displayed by African American soldiers helped to build a case for the post-war amendments to the Constitution, including the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, securing voting rights. Notable figures and units. Company C, under the leadership of General Thomas Jefferson Morgan, played a notable role during the American Civil War. General Morgan was an influential figure in the Union Army and contributed significantly to the efforts of African American soldiers in the United States Colored Troops, USCT. General Thomas Jefferson Morgan. Early life and military career. Thomas Jefferson Morgan was born on August 17, 1839, in Franklin, Indiana. He began his career in education before joining the Union Army at the outbreak of the Civil War. His leadership skills and dedication quickly became apparent, leading to his promotion through the ranks. Advocacy for African American troops. Morgan was a strong advocate for the inclusion of African Americans in the Union Army. He recognized the strategic and moral importance of enlisting formerly enslaved and free African Americans to fight for the Union cause. His efforts helped to shape the policies that allowed for the formation of the USCT. Company C and the USCT formation and recruitment. Company C was part of the broader United States Colored Troops, which were organized following the Emancipation Proclamation. Recruitment for these units took place across the Union and in liberated Confederate territories, drawing volunteers from both free African American communities and emancipated slaves. Leadership and training. Under the command of officers like General Morgan, the soldiers of Company C underwent rigorous training to prepare for combat. Despite facing racial prejudice and skepticism about their capabilities, these troops demonstrated exceptional bravery and resilience. Combat roles and engagements. Company C, like many other USCT units, was actively involved in various military engagements. These soldiers participated in critical battles and operations that contributed to the Union's success. Their roles often placed them on the front lines where they faced significant dangers and hardships. Notable actions and contributions. Battle participation. Company C, under General Morgan's leadership, took part in several important battles during the Civil War. The involvement of USCT units in battles such as the Siege of Petersburg and the Battle of Fort Wagner showcased their fighting spirit and determination. Impact on the war effort. The contributions of Company C and other USCT units were vital to the Union war effort. They not only bolstered the numbers of the Union Army, but also provided a moral boost by embodying the fight for freedom and equality. Their presence on the battlefield challenged the Confederacy's ideologies and weakened its resolve. Legacy of service. The bravery and service of Company C under General Morgan's leadership left a lasting legacy. These soldiers helped to pave the way for the eventual abolition of slavery and the recognition of African American rights. Their sacrifices and achievements highlighted the importance of African American contributions to the nation's history. General Morgan's post-war contributions. Advocate for education and civil rights. After the war, Thomas Jefferson Morgan continued to advocate for the rights and education of African Americans. He served as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs under President Benjamin Harrison, where he worked to improve the education and living conditions of Native Americans. Legacy of leadership. General Morgan's legacy is marked by his commitment to justice and equality. His leadership of Company C and his post-war efforts in education and civil rights exemplify his dedication to the principles of freedom and equality for all Americans. Company C, under the command of General Thomas Jefferson Morgan, played a critical role in the Union's victory during the Civil War. The courage and dedication of these African American soldiers helped to shape the course of the war and laid the groundwork for future advancements in civil rights. General Morgan's leadership and advocacy for equality remain an important part of American history, reflecting the enduring struggle for justice and the contributions of African American soldiers to the nation's legacy. The legacy of the USCT is profound. Their service and sacrifice during the Civil War not only contributed to the Union's victory, but also paved the way for future generations of African Americans to serve in the military and advocate for equal rights. The courage and dedication of the USCT soldiers stand as a testament to their fight for freedom and equality, and their contributions remain a vital part of American history. After the Civil War ended in 1865, many Confederate soldiers were released from Union prisons and returned to their homes in the South. The response and actions of these former Confederate soldiers varied widely, but several key trends and outcomes can be identified. Reintegration and reconstruction, returning home. Many former Confederate soldiers returned to a devastated South, with its economy in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, and social systems upended. The immediate priority for many was to rebuild their lives, homes, and communities amidst widespread poverty and hardship. Resistance to Reconstruction. A significant number of former Confederate soldiers and sympathizers harbored resentment and bitterness towards the Union and the federal government's Reconstruction policies. These policies aimed to rebuild the South, integrate formerly enslaved African Americans into society as free citizens, and enforce new civil rights protections. Formation of paramilitary groups. Ku Klux Klan, KKK. One of the most notable responses was the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Founded by 6 former Confederate soldiers, including Nathan Bedford Forrest, the KKK sought to resist Reconstruction efforts through violence and intimidation. The Klan targeted African Americans, as well as white Republicans and others who supported Reconstruction, using tactics such as lynchings, beatings, and arson to terrorize and suppress these communities. Other paramilitary groups. In addition to the KKK, other paramilitary groups emerged, such as the White League in Louisiana and the Red Shirts in South Carolina. These groups operated with the goal of restoring white supremacy and undermining Reconstruction efforts through violent means. Ulysses S. Grant played a significant role in the suppression of the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, during his presidency, particularly through his efforts to enforce civil rights and protect African Americans in the South during the Reconstruction era. Here's a detailed account of his involvement and actions against the KKK. Background: the rise of the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, by a group of Confederate veterans. The Klan quickly grew into a widespread terrorist organization aimed at restoring white supremacy in the South by using violence and intimidation against African Americans and their allies. The Klan targeted black voters, political leaders, and anyone who supported Reconstruction and civil rights for freed slaves. Grant's presidency and anti-Klan efforts. Election and initial challenges. Ulysses S. Grant was elected as the 18th President of the United States in 1868, succeeding Andrew Johnson. Grant, a former Union general, was committed to enforcing Reconstruction policies and protecting the civil rights of African Americans. He faced significant resistance from white supremacist groups, including the KKK, who sought to undermine these efforts. The Enforcement Acts. In response to the violence and intimidation perpetrated by the KKK, Congress passed a series of enforcement acts between 1870 and 1871, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts. These laws were designed to protect the civil rights of African Americans and to curb the activities of the Klan and other similar groups. Enforcement Act of 1870. This act aimed to protect African Americans' right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, and receive equal protection under the law. It authorized the federal government to intervene when states failed to protect these rights. Enforcement Act of 1871, Second Enforcement Act. This act expanded the federal government's ability to prosecute those who conspired to deny citizens their constitutional rights, particularly targeting Klan violence. Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, Third Enforcement Act. This act, passed in April 1871, specifically targeted the KKK by authorizing the president to use federal troops to suppress the Klan, suspend habeas corpus in areas deemed to be in a state of insurrection, and prosecute individuals involved in Klan activities. Grant's actions against the KKK. Grant's determination. President Grant was determined to enforce these laws and combat the Klan's influence. He declared parts of the South to be in a state of insurrection and used federal troops and marshals to restore order and protect African American communities. Federal intervention. In October 1871, Grant declared martial law in 9 counties in South Carolina, a hotbed of Klan activity. federal troops were deployed to the region and mass arrests of Klan members ensued. This decisive action significantly weakened the Klan's power and demonstrated the federal government's commitment to enforcing civil rights. Prosecutions and suppression. Grant's administration vigorously prosecuted Klan members, leading to numerous convictions and imprisonments. These efforts, combined with the presence of federal troops, disrupted the Klan's operations and contributed to a significant decline in their activities during the early 1870s. Impact and legacy. Short-term success. Grant's actions against the KKK were initially successful in curbing the violence and restoring a degree of order in the South. The federal government's intervention demonstrated a commitment to protecting African American rights and upholding Reconstruction policies. Long-term challenges. Despite these efforts, the Klan and other white supremacist groups eventually resurfaced and continued to undermine Reconstruction. The withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877 as part of the Compromise of 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction and allowed white supremacist groups to regain power, leading to the establishment of Jim Crow laws and the disenfranchisement of African Americans. Historical significance. Ulysses S. Grant's actions against the KKK set a precedent for federal intervention in the protection of civil rights. His use of federal authority to combat domestic terrorism and protect marginalized communities remains a significant aspect of his presidency and a critical chapter in the history of the Reconstruction era. Ulysses S. Grant's efforts to suppress the KKK during his presidency were a vital part of the federal government's attempts to enforce Reconstruction and protect the civil rights of African Americans. While his actions were initially successful, the long-term challenges of Reconstruction and the eventual resurgence of white supremacist groups underscore the complexities and difficulties of achieving lasting racial equality in the United States. Grant's commitment to justice and the rule of law in the face of domestic terrorism remains an important legacy of his administration. The period from 1870 to the early 1900s was marked by numerous racial massacres in the United States, primarily targeting African Americans. These violent events were often fueled by racial tensions, economic competition, and efforts to maintain white supremacy in the post-Reconstruction era. Here is an overview of some significant massacres during this period. Colfax Massacre, 1873. Location: Colfax, Louisiana. Date: April 13th. 1873. Background: the massacre occurred during a dispute over the results of the 1872 Louisiana gubernatorial election. White Democrats contested the election results and sought to oust the Republican government, which included African American officials. Events: a white paramilitary group called the White League attacked the Grant Parish Courthouse, where black Republicans had fortified themselves. The attackers set the courthouse on fire and killed approximately 150 African Americans. Aftermath: the incident demonstrated the violent lengths to which white supremacists would go to regain political control. It also highlighted the federal government's limitations in protecting African Americans during Reconstruction. Hamburg Massacre, 1876. Location: Hamburg, South Carolina. Date: July 8, 1876. Background: tensions were high in the South as white Democrats sought to regain control from Republican governments supported by African Americans. Events: a confrontation between a black militia and white Democrats escalated into a violent clash. White supremacist groups, including the Red Shirts, attacked the black militia members, killing several and capturing others. Aftermath: the massacre was part of the broader redemption efforts by Southern Democrats to overthrow Reconstruction governments and reestablish white dominance. Exodusters, the Exodus of 1879. The Exodusters were African Americans who migrated from states along the Mississippi River to Kansas in the late 19th century, part of the Exoduster movement, or Exodus of 1879. This migration was driven by the desire to escape the harsh realities of life in the post-Reconstruction South, including disenfranchisement, economic hardship, and widespread racial violence. Causes of the Exoduster movement: disenfranchisement and Jim Crow laws. After the Reconstruction era, Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised African Americans and enforced racial segregation. These laws, along with black codes, rendered African Americans second-class citizens and stripped them of political power and civil rights. Economic hardship. The economic depression of the 1870s exacerbated the difficulties faced by African Americans in the South. White merchants and planters increased prices and interest rates for black laborers, trapping them in cycles of debt and poverty. Federal efforts to promote land ownership for African Americans were largely undermined, leaving many without land or homes. Mass racial violence. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League used violence and intimidation to maintain white supremacy. African Americans faced lynchings, beatings, and other forms of terror, creating a climate of fear and insecurity. The White League, for instance, seized arms from the New Orleans arsenal, demonstrating their capacity for organized violence. The migration. Numbers and destinations. The Exoduster movement saw as many as 40,000 African Americans leave the South, with around 26,000 arriving in Kansas. Other destinations included Oklahoma and Colorado. The movement received support from figures like Benjamin Singleton of Tennessee and Henry Adams of Louisiana. Reality in Kansas. The most successful exodusters settled in urban centers, finding work as domestic or trade workers. Those who attempted to homestead faced significant challenges, as the best farmland had already been claimed by squatters, railroads, and speculators. Many settled in the less fertile uplands and struggled with poor soil and harsh conditions. Response and support. Stranded migrants and relief efforts. Many exodusters found themselves stranded in St. Louis when steamboat captains refused to carry them across the Missouri River. Black churches in St. Louis, along with Eastern philanthropists, formed the Colored Relief Board and the Kansas Freedmen's Aid Society to support the migrants. Despite some local resistance, these organizations raised significant funds to help the exodusters reach their destinations. Government and political response. The federal and state governments largely failed to support the black migrants. Local officials in Kansas, like Topeka Mayor Michael C. Case, often refused to provide aid, believing resources would be better spent sending the migrants back south. Southern white Democrats and some conservative black leaders viewed the migration with suspicion, attributing it to agitation by a small group of black leaders and outside white influences. Impact of the Exoduster movement. Demographic changes. The migration led to a significant increase in the black population of Kansas, with the state seeing an influx of around 26,000 African Americans during the 1870s. Several black settlements, such as Nicodemus, Kansas, were established and continue to exist today. Labor relations. The Exoduster migration had a mixed impact on labor relations in the South. While it did not end violence against African Americans, it did create temporary benefits for black laborers in areas with labor shortages, leading to better lease terms and fewer long-term contract commitments. Legacy. The Exoduster movement is remembered as a significant chapter in African American history. It demonstrated the resilience and agency of African Americans in seeking better lives despite the oppressive conditions of the post-Reconstruction South. The migration also underscored the continuing struggle for civil rights and economic justice in the face of systemic racism and violence. Political disenfranchisement. Former Confederate soldiers and their allies worked to disenfranchise African American voters and reclaim political power in the South. They employed a variety of methods, including violence, intimidation, and discriminatory laws, to prevent African Americans from voting and participating in the political process. Reclaiming power. The efforts of these groups, combined with the waning support for Reconstruction in the North, eventually led to the end of Reconstruction in 1877. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election of 1876, resulted in the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and the return of local control to white Southern Democrats. This marked the beginning of the Jim Crow era, characterized by the institutionalization of racial segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans. Economic and social adjustments. Sharecropping and tenant farming. Many former Confederate soldiers, along with other Southern whites and freed African Americans, turned to sharecropping and tenant farming as a means of economic survival. This system often trapped both black and white farmers in a cycle of debt and poverty, but it was particularly exploitative towards African Americans. Lost cause ideology. A cultural response among former Confederates was the development and promotion of the lost cause ideology. This narrative romanticized the Confederacy, portraying the Southern cause as noble and just, and the Civil War as a struggle for states' rights rather than the preservation of slavery. Monuments, literature, and organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy helped to propagate this view, which influenced Southern identity and memory of the war for generations. The response of former Confederate soldiers after being released from prison was multifaceted and had long-lasting implications for the South and the entire United States. While many sought to rebuild their lives peacefully, a significant number engaged in efforts to resist Reconstruction and maintain white supremacy through violence and political maneuvering. The legacy of these actions contributed to the systemic racial inequalities that persisted well into the 20th century and continue to influence American society today. The Great Migration, 1916 to 1970, saw millions of African Americans move from the South to northern and western states to escape racial violence and seek better economic opportunities. This migration was a direct response to the terror and systemic oppression that continued in the South post-Reconstruction, showing that the conflict over racial equality persisted. Wilmington Insurrection, 1898. Location: Wilmington, North Carolina. Date: November 10, 1898. Background: Wilmington had a biracial government and a thriving African American middle class, which threatened white supremacist ideologies. Events: White supremacists, including members of the Democratic Party and the Red Shirts, launched a violent coup to overthrow the local government. They killed at least 60 African Americans, destroyed black-owned businesses, and forced black leaders into exile. Aftermath: The insurrection led to the establishment of a white supremacist government in Wilmington and was a significant event in the disfranchisement of African Americans in North Carolina. Atlanta Race Riot, 1906. Location: Atlanta, Georgia. Date: September 22 to 24, 1906. Background: Racial tensions were exacerbated by newspaper reports of alleged assaults on white women by black men and economic competition between black and white workers. Events: White mobs attacked African American neighborhoods, businesses, and individuals. The violence resulted in the deaths of an estimated 25 to 40 African Americans and extensive property damage. Aftermath: The riot further entrenched racial segregation and economic disparities in Atlanta and highlighted the vulnerability of African American communities to mob violence. Springfield Race Riot, 1908. Location: Springfield, Illinois. Date: August 14 to 16, 1908. Background: The alleged assault of a white woman by a black man and the subsequent lynching attempt fueled racial tensions in the city. Events: White mobs attacked African American neighborhoods, lynching 2 black men and causing widespread destruction. Approximately 40 black homes and businesses were destroyed. Aftermath: The riot led to the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909, aimed at combating racial violence and promoting civil rights. Other notable massacres: Thibodaux Massacre, 1887. Location: Thibodaux, Louisiana. Date: November 23, 1887. Background: African American sugarcane workers went on strike for better wages and working conditions. Events: White vigilantes attacked the striking workers, killing an estimated 35 to 300 African Americans. Aftermath: The massacre ended the strike and reinforced the power of white landowners over black laborers. New Orleans Massacre, 1866. Location: New Orleans, Louisiana. Date: July 30th, 1866. Background: A political convention was held to oppose the black codes and support voting rights for African Americans. Events: White mobs, including police and firemen, attacked the convention, killing approximately 34 African Americans and wounding over 100. Aftermath: The massacre underscored the violent resistance to Reconstruction and the need for federal intervention to protect civil rights. The massacres between 1870 and the early 1900s were part of a broader pattern of racial violence aimed at maintaining white supremacy and suppressing African American progress. These events had profound and long-lasting impacts on African American communities, contributing to the Great Migration and the formation of civil rights organizations like the NAACP. They also highlighted the persistent challenges of racial equality and justice in the United States. Civil rights movement. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was a direct challenge to the systemic racism and segregation established during the post-Reconstruction era. The struggle for civil rights, culminating in landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, highlighted the ongoing battle over racial equality and federal authority versus states' rights. Modern political and social struggles. Political realignment and the Southern strategy. The political realignment that began in the 1960s saw the South shift from solidly Democratic to predominantly Republican, a transformation fueled by resistance to civil rights advancements. The Southern strategy, employed by the Republican Party, aimed to attract white voters in the South by appealing to their opposition to desegregation and civil rights legislation. This strategy solidified the political and ideological divide rooted in the Civil War era. Voter suppression and gerrymandering. Contemporary efforts to suppress minority voting rights, such as strict voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, and gerrymandering, echo the post-Reconstruction tactics used to disenfranchise African Americans. These actions are often justified under the guise of preventing voter fraud, but disproportionately affect minority communities, continuing the struggle over political power and representation. Systemic racism and racial inequality. Systemic racism remains a pervasive issue in American society, affecting areas such as criminal justice, education, housing, and employment. The Black Lives Matter movement and other social justice initiatives highlight the ongoing fight against racial inequality and the legacy of slavery and segregation. These movements often face significant backlash, demonstrating the persistence of conflict over racial justice. Critical race theory, CRT, is an intellectual and social movement and a framework of legal analysis that examines the relationship between race, law, and power in the United States. It emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s as a response to what scholars perceived as the slow pace of racial reform in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. CRT seeks to understand how laws and legal institutions perpetuate racial inequalities and to challenge the ways in which race and racial power are constructed and maintained. Key concepts and principles. Race and racism are central. CRT posits that race and racism are not just individual biases but are embedded in legal systems and policies. Racism is seen as an ordinary, not exceptional, experience for people of color. Intersectionality. CRT emphasizes the interconnectedness of various forms of social stratification, such as race, gender, class, and sexuality. This concept, introduced by Kimberlé Crenshaw, highlights how different forms of discrimination overlap and compound each other. Social construction of race. CRT argues that race is a social construct, not a biological reality. This perspective highlights how society creates and maintains racial categories to justify and perpetuate inequality. Interest convergence. Proposed by Derek Bell, this principle suggests that white elites will support racial justice only when they perceive that it benefits their own interests. Meaningful changes to racial policies often occur when the interests of white people align with those of racial minorities. Critique of liberalism. CRT scholars criticize liberal approaches to racial justice, such as colorblindness and incrementalism, for being insufficient to address systemic racism. They argue that these approaches often ignore the deep-rooted nature of racial inequalities. Narrative and counter-narrative. CRT values the use of storytelling and personal narratives from people of color to challenge dominant societal narratives that uphold racial stereotypes and inequalities. These counter-narratives serve to expose the realities of those who are marginalized. Applications and influence. Legal scholarship. CRT originated in legal studies and has since influenced a wide range of fields, including education, sociology, political science, and ethnic studies. Legal scholars use CRT to analyze and critique laws and legal institutions that perpetuate racial inequalities. Educational practices. CRT has been applied to understand and address disparities in education. It has informed practices aimed at making curricula more inclusive and addressing the racial biases in educational policies and practices. Public policy. CRT provides a framework for analyzing public policies through a lens that considers their impact on different racial groups. This approach seeks to uncover how ostensibly neutral policies may perpetuate racial disparities. Controversies and criticisms. Misconceptions and political backlash. CRT has faced significant backlash, particularly from conservative groups and politicians who argue that it promotes division and portrays the United States as fundamentally racist. Critics often misconstrue CRT as teaching people to hate their country or each other. Complexity and accessibility. Some argue that CRT's academic language and concepts can be complex and inaccessible to the general public, making it challenging to communicate its principles effectively outside of scholarly contexts. Critical race theory is a powerful framework for understanding and challenging the ways in which race and racism intersect with law, politics, and society. Despite controversies and misunderstandings, CRT continues to be a vital tool for scholars, educators, and activists seeking to address and dismantle systemic racial inequalities. To argue that Project 2025 is proof that critical race theory CRT is a reality and not merely a theoretical framework, one must demonstrate how the project's goals, strategies, and implications align with the core tenets of CRT. Here's how such a case can be constructed. Understanding Project 2025. Project 2025. Project 2025 is a conservative initiative that aims to implement a comprehensive agenda to reshape the federal government by reducing its size, curbing regulatory powers, and promoting conservative policies across various sectors, including education, immigration, and environmental regulation. This project, led by prominent conservative organizations, plans to influence federal policies significantly if Republicans gain control of the executive branch. Alignment with CRT's tenets. 1. Race and racism are embedded in legal systems and policies. Project 2025's goals. One of Project 2025's objectives is to dismantle regulations and policies enacted during previous administrations that aim to address racial inequalities. For example, efforts to roll back affirmative action, diversity initiatives, and other civil rights protections. CRT's perspective. CRT argues that racism is embedded in the fabric of legal and political institutions. The push by Project 2025 to undo policies designed to mitigate racial disparities illustrates how systemic racism can be perpetuated through legislative and executive actions. 2. Critique of liberalism. Project 2025's strategy. The project promotes a vision of colorblind policies, arguing that race-conscious policies are themselves discriminatory. This approach aligns with the conservative critique of CRT and the promotion of a merit-based system devoid of racial considerations. CRT's perspective. CRT critiques liberal approaches, such as colorblindness, for ignoring the structural and historical contexts of racial inequalities. Project 2025's emphasis on eliminating race-conscious policies supports CRT's assertion that such colorblind approaches fail to address the root causes of racial disparities. 3. Interest convergence. Project 2025's appeal. The project garners support by framing its goals as beneficial for the broader population, including economically disadvantaged whites. This aligns with Derek Bell's theory of interest convergence, which posits that racial progress occurs when it aligns with the interests of white elites. CRT's perspective. The framing of Project 2025's policies as universally beneficial, while potentially undermining specific gains for racial minorities, demonstrates how interest convergence operates in policymaking. The project's agenda serves to maintain existing power structures that benefit the majority group. 4. Social construction of race. Project 2025's narrative. The project advocates for policies that downplay the significance of race, promoting a narrative that any focus on racial identity is divisive and counterproductive. CRT's perspective. CRT highlights that race is a social construct used to uphold systemic inequalities. Project 2025's efforts to negate the importance of race in policy discussions reinforce the idea that ignoring racial constructs perpetuates existing disparities. 5. Narrative and counter-narrative. Project 2025's messaging. The project employs a counter-narrative to CRT, framing it as a divisive and radical ideology that distorts American values. This narrative aims to reshape public understanding and discredit efforts to address racial inequalities. CRT's perspective. CRT values counter-narratives that expose the realities of marginalized groups. The existence of Project 2025's counter-narrative underscores the ongoing struggle over whose stories and experiences are validated and recognized in policymaking. Real-world implications. Educational policies. Project 2025 advocates for changes in educational policies, such as the elimination of curricula that include CRT or discussions of systemic racism. This aligns with CRT's assertion that educational institutions are battlegrounds for ideological control and the perpetuation of racial inequalities. Voting rights and representation. Efforts by Project 2025 to influence voting regulations and reduce federal oversight in elections can lead to disenfranchisement of minority voters, reflecting CRT's focus on how legal frameworks can perpetuate racial disparities in political representation. Economic and environmental policies. Project 2025's push to roll back regulations can disproportionately affect communities of color, who often bear the brunt of environmental degradation and economic inequality. This reflects CRT's emphasis on intersectionality and the compounded impact of race and class. Project 2025 serves as a real-world example of how the principles outlined by critical race theory manifest in contemporary policymaking. The project's goals, strategies, and potential impacts illustrate the embedded nature of racial inequalities in legal and political systems, the critique of colorblind approaches, and the power of counter-narratives in shaping public discourse. Therefore, Project 2025 not only highlights the relevance of CRT, but also underscores its reality as a framework for understanding and addressing systemic racism in America. Is Project 2025 a doctrine of the KKK? Project 2025 is a conservative initiative designed to reshape the federal government by reducing its size, curbing regulatory powers, and promoting conservative policies across various sectors, including education, immigration, and environmental regulation. It aims to significantly influence federal policies if Republicans gain control of the executive branch. Ku Klux Klan, KKK. The KKK is a white supremacist hate group with a long history of promoting racist, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, and anti-Catholic ideologies. The Klan has been responsible for numerous acts of violence and terrorism aimed at maintaining white supremacy and opposing civil rights for African Americans and other minority groups. Key points of alignment. 1. Rollback of civil rights protections. Project 2025. The project aims to dismantle regulations and policies that promote affirmative action, diversity initiatives, and other civil rights protections. Appeal to the KKK. The KKK opposes civil rights advancements and supports the rollback of policies that promote racial equality. Project 2025's efforts to eliminate these protections align with the KKK's goal of maintaining racial hierarchies and white dominance. 2. Immigration policies. Project 2025. The project advocates for stricter immigration controls and policies that limit immigration from non-European countries. Appeal to the KKK. The KKK has historically promoted nativist and anti-immigrant sentiments, favoring restrictive immigration policies to maintain the racial purity of the United States. Project 2025's stance on immigration would likely resonate with the Klan's objectives. 3. Education and curriculum changes. Project 2025. The initiative seeks to remove curricula that include critical race theory, CRT, or discussions of systemic racism, advocating for a more patriotic education that downplays the history of racial oppression. Appeal to the KKK. The KKK opposes educational content that highlights racial injustices and promotes equality. Project 2025's push to eliminate CRT and similar teachings aligns with the Klan's desire to suppress narratives that challenge white supremacist ideologies. 4. Law enforcement and policing. Project 2025. The project emphasizes law and order policies, potentially increasing funding and support for law enforcement while reducing oversight and accountability. Appeal to the KKK. The Klan has often supported aggressive policing tactics, especially those that disproportionately target minority communities. Project 2025's law and order stance may appeal to the KKK's desire for stringent law enforcement that reinforces racial hierarchies. Potential implications: reinforcement of racial inequities. Project 2025's policies could reinforce racial inequities by dismantling protections and initiatives designed to promote racial equality. This aligns with the KKK's goal of maintaining a racially stratified society. Empowerment of white supremacist ideologies. By promoting policies that align with white supremacist goals, Project 2025 may indirectly empower groups like the KKK, giving them a sense of validation and legitimacy. This can embolden white supremacist groups and potentially lead to increased recruitment and activism. Undermining of civil rights progress. The rollback of civil rights protections and diversity initiatives under Project 2025 could undermine decades of progress made in the fight for racial equality. This regression aligns with the KKK's long-standing efforts to oppose civil rights movements and maintain white supremacy. A case can be made that Project 2025 will be appealing to the KKK by examining the alignment between the project's goals and the ideologies historically and currently espoused by the Klan. The rollback of civil rights protections, stricter immigration policies, changes in education curricula, and emphasis on law and order all resonate with the KKK's objectives. While Project 2025 may not explicitly align itself with white supremacist groups, the potential implications of its policies could indirectly support and appeal to organizations like the KKK, reinforcing racial inequities and empowering white supremacist ideologies.